All right, good morning to my B-Day classes. Sorry that I can't be with you today, but I'm at jail on the field trip. So I am just going to record this so that you can take notes this way. And then if you have any questions from anything that I talk about here today, certainly you can ask next time. You should get information today about registering to sign up for the AP exam. You should also work on your practice FRQ. You've got a must-know quiz on 1 through 40 next time I see you, which would be Thursday. And then your test and FRQ for chapters 4 and 5 is scheduled for next week on Wednesday, November the 2nd. So let's get in. Today we're going to talk some about the executive branch, just kind of introduce a few things to you, talk about some of the president's powers. But before we get to that, we're going to look at 3 constitutional qualifications to be president. These are the only 3 requirements that you have to meet in order to be president. So first, you got to be at least 35 years old. That means Mr. Holland, finally old enough to be president. So in 2024, if you don't know who to vote for, you can certainly vote for me. You also have to be a natural born citizen. You have to be born a citizen of the United States. That's the only federal elected office that you have to be born a citizen in order to hold. Remember, House of Representatives, you only have to have been a citizen for 7 years. Senate, you only have to have been a citizen for 9 years. But for the presidency, you have to be born a citizen of the United States. That means you're either born on U.S. soil or you're born to at least one parent who is a U.S. citizen. And then you have to live in the United States for 14 years. The founders were concerned that someone might be born a citizen but might move to England and get a whole bunch of crazy ideas about monarchy and then come back and try to bring those crazy ideas with them. So you have to have lived in the United States for at least 14 years. And that's it. That's the only 3 constitutional requirements that you have to meet in order to be president. But the next part of this is going to talk about what we might call unwritten requirements or unwritten qualifications. So I've listed them here as questions. What I mean by unwritten qualifications are things that have been true of most presidents or things that voters might expect from their presidential candidates. So things that have been true of most presidents or things that voters might expect of their presidential candidates. So I'm just going to run through a few of these real quick, and most of them probably will not come as a surprise to you. So most presidents have been married and tend to have kids. I think the only president who was unmarried was James Buchanan. Most presidents are only married once. To my knowledge, I believe there have only been 2 divorced presidents, Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. So voters tend to like their presidents to represent sort of the all-American family or the family ideal, even if voters don't tend to live up to that ideal themselves. Most of our presidents are older. You only have to be 35 according to the Constitution, but most of our presidents, they have past experience in government. They tend to be in their 50s and their 60s. Our current president is 80. And so I believe our current president, Joe Biden, is the oldest president ever elected. So they're not getting any younger, that's for sure. In terms of religion, all of our presidents have identified in some form or fashion as Christian. The overwhelming majority have identified as Protestants. John Kennedy was our first Catholic president, and it was kind of a big deal for him to be Catholic. A lot of voters were concerned that he would turn decision-making power over to the Pope, and he had to give a speech saying that he wouldn't do that. We're on our second Catholic president now, President Joe Biden. There is this part in the Constitution that says you can't require a test for someone, a religious test for someone to serve an elected office. But voters might take that into account when they're voting. They might want their president to be more or less religious. Most of our presidents have previous experience either in elected office or in the military. So most of them have served in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, they've served as state governors, or they've been in the military. So folks like Dwight Eisenhower, who did not have previous experience in elected office, but he did liberate Europe during the Second World War. So we kind of let that slide. And all but one of our presidents have been white. Obviously, Barack Obama being the exception. They all tend to be pretty wealthy on the socioeconomic status side of things, high income or wealthy. They tend to be pretty affluent. They've all been men so far. And then this question of moral leadership. Voters tend to want the president to be someone that people can look up to, can follow, again, as kind of that American ideal. Of course, your mileage may vary as a voter for what qualifies as good character. And certainly voters who are fans of a particular president might make lots of excuses for what gets seen as their moral failings. We've seen that for presidents in the past of both major parties. So the other thing I want to get into today are formal and informal powers. Formal powers are things written in the Constitution that the president can do. And then informal powers will be things not written in the Constitution that have evolved over time. Of course, we know the president can sign or veto bills. So that's a huge check for the president on Congress. Most of the time, if the president vetoes a bill, it's just your normal, ordinary veto. He gets the bill, he vetoes it, and it's done. College Board wants you to know this term, a pocket veto, as well. A pocket veto only happens if both houses of Congress pass a bill and then they adjourn, meaning they're not just done for the day, they're going back home to their home state, they're adjourning, they're leaving. If Congress passes a bill and then adjourns within 10 days, and the president does nothing with the bill, it is vetoed. He doesn't have to do anything with it, it is vetoed. Normally, if Congress is in session and they pass a bill and the president does nothing with it, it becomes law without his signature. But if they adjourn, he can do this pocket veto. That never really happens anymore. It's still in government curriculum to learn that term. It just never happens. In terms of foreign policy, the president has several powers. So appointing ambassadors to other countries is definitely a big one. The Senate has to confirm those ambassadors, but that's a big way to influence our relationship with other countries. And the president receives ambassadors and leaders from other countries to meet with them, to negotiate, and to talk about foreign policy. The president's also the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. That's a huge way that the president carries out foreign policy. Another important formal power is the president's ability to enforce the law. And so all those various bureaucratic agencies that we've talked about before report to the president as their highest boss. The president appoints the leaders of those agencies with Senate confirmation, and then those agencies actually carry out the law. And so the president is the leader of all of those agencies. We've talked about this before with things like the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, those literal law enforcement agencies. But even beyond that, things like the Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency. These are agencies and administrations that the president leads. And so the president's ideology plays a huge role in how they enforce the law. The president has the power to pardon anyone convicted of a federal crime, not state crimes, only federal crimes. And so you see this example down in the bottom corner of President Gerald Ford pardoning former President Richard Nixon. So Nixon at that point could no longer be prosecuted. It was as though any of those crimes never happened. Presidents can also shorten sentences as part of that. They can, that's called commuting a sentence. President Joe Biden recently used this pardon power for thousands of inmates who had been convicted of nonviolent drug offenses. And so it was only federal crimes, not state crimes, but he pardoned people using that presidential power. And there's not really any checks on the pardon power. It can go a pretty long way. And you see this example down at the bottom of the former President Donald Trump pardoning a Thanksgiving turkey, which has become part of our American tradition for celebrating Thanksgiving, is the president pardoning a turkey. And then the last thing on formal powers, signing or vetoing the budget. Remember, Congress writes the budget, but if a new one doesn't get signed by the president before the old one runs out, then the government shuts down. So that's a huge part of presidential authority. And the last thing, as far as notes go, are these informal powers. So these are things that are not written down in the Constitution. These are things that have evolved over time, that presidents have sort of stepped into these roles, and it's just sort of happened. And so they're now part of the job, even though they're not written in the Constitution. A big one is executive orders. Executive orders can be done without Congress. They have the force of law, but they have to exist within the current law. Presidents can't use them to repeal laws. So they have to be constitutional. They have to follow the law as it's currently written. But executive orders are a way for presidents to clarify how they plan to enforce the law. A big example of an executive order that we've talked about before is DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. President Obama created the DACA program by executive order to protect people brought to the United States without documentation from being deported. So it was his way of saying, I see what the immigration law is, but I'm going to pass this executive order and I'm going to clarify how I plan to enforce that law. Executive orders are nice because they don't require Congress, but the problem with them is that they can be undone by a future president without Congress. So frequently, the first few months of a president's new term are spent undoing the executive orders of the previous president and writing some new ones. So that was common for President Biden. That was common for Donald Trump before him, Barack Obama before him, George W. Bush before him. You spend a lot of that first year undoing the previous guy's executive orders and putting in some new ones. Similar to executive orders on the foreign policy front are executive agreements. It's kind of like a treaty, but it's an agreement between the executive branch and another country. Doesn't require Congress. You don't need that 2/3 of a Senate like you would for a treaty. It just requires the executive branch. But just like an executive order, a future president can undo an executive agreement. One that gets talked about a lot in the news is the Iran nuclear deal. Obama negotiates this nuclear deal with Iran and a few other countries. When Trump became president, he undid that executive agreement. And now Joe Biden is trying to bring Iran back to the table and renegotiate it. Presidents, of course, have to spend their time bargaining with Congress, persuading, compromising. The picture that's over here on the right has President Biden, along with 2 Democratic senators who are difficult for him to get along with. Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona, Joe Manchin from West Virginia. They are huge thorns in President Biden's side because they are tough negotiators. And right now, there's only 50 Democrats in the Senate, so the president needs every single one to get his agenda through. And so it takes a lot of persuading and a lot of compromising with those 2 senators in particular, or with the other guy in this picture, Mitch McConnell, who's the Republican Party leader. And of course, he's a tough negotiator too, because he's of the other party. The bully pulpit is a term we use to describe the president's negotiation with the American people when the president tries to sell their agenda to voters. And so the bully pulpit might take the form of the president literally touring the country and going around giving speeches to people pushing his agenda. It might take the form of a televised address to voters, talking to them directly, or it might take the form of social media. The White House has a Twitter account, the president has a Twitter account, and they might be trying to take their message to voters that way. Presidents issue what are called signing statements when they sign bills into law. Sometimes those signing statements talk about how excited they are to sign that bill and how much they love that bill. Sometimes signing statements are, I really hate this bill, I didn't want to sign it, but I feel like I have to, and I'm going to try my darndest not to enforce this law because I think it's stupid or unconstitutional. So sometimes signing statements are a big celebration. Sometimes they're a passive-aggressive way for presidents to say, I didn't want to sign this bill, but I feel like I'm being forced into it. Presidents serve as the face, the leader of their political party. Remember, political parties are not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution at all. But when someone becomes president, they kind of unofficially become the face of the party. And so in the midterm elections coming up, a lot of people are going to be voting based on how they feel Joe Biden is doing as president, even though Joe Biden is not on the ballot at all. And so presidents tend to serve as their party leader. The issues that presidents emphasize get emphasized by the rest of the party in Congress and in elected offices throughout the states. And the president serves as a sort of symbolic leader for the whole country. If there's something to celebrate, like the 4th of July, Thanksgiving, pardoning turkeys, whatever you got to do, the president is going to be present for that. Or if there's some kind of national tragedy, a natural disaster, school shooting, something like that, presidents are expected to be what's called the mourner in chief. They're going to kind of lead the country in grieving and mourning. So in that way, they kind of speak for all of us. They're sort of our chief citizen, our symbolic leader. So if you get a chance to check out this little video up here about executive orders, it's really just kind of a funny satire. It's a Saturday Night Live video, but it makes the point that executive orders just kind of happen without needing much from Congress. And it's just a way for presidents to kind of do what they want. And again, none of the things on this informal powers list are in the Constitution. They are all things that have evolved over time. So that's as far as we're going to go for today. We'll pick up with the rest of this next time. We only have 2 more classes left for executive branch. And like I said before, your test will be on Wednesday, November 2nd for B-Day. You'll have must-knows next time. Make sure you're registering for the AP exam. If you have questions, definitely reach out to me by Canvas. And I will see you all on Thursday.